Hello, Mr. Kamath. Welcome to our podcast.
Thank you so much. Pleasure to be here.
A lot of people who are watching this, they might not know what exactly sports lawyer does.
Yeah, I mean, there is a debate on whether there's such a thing as a sports lawyer at all. Right?
Exactly.
So, I mean, there are lawyers and then there are matters relating to sport.
Yes.
But typically when you look at a sort of a profession of lawyering within sport, there can be many different elements. So one is
coming to the latest draft, sports governance bill of 2024, and I wanted to have your opinion on it.
Sports governance bill, it's in draft stage and it actually followed the draft sports policy as well. So these are two documents that are in play right now. But if you look at the most recent draft national sports policy, it really talks about sport as part of a nation building exercise.
Nice.
So the role of sport in economic development could be manufacturing, it could be tourism, skilling and jobs that come from sport.
A topic which is quite grey in the sporting world, that is the gender problem.
There are multiple very challenging issues. One of them is where there are DSD athletes, so people with differences in sexual development.
Yeah.
There are people who have both male and female organs, different chromosomal structures, and they're born like that.
Yeah.
So it's a very hard line. Do you classify them as male or female?
Yeah. Welcome to the House of Glory, the sports podcast powered by Nikon India, behind the scenes, beyond the game. And today I have a very special guest with me because it's a very fascinating, well-rounded package. When you talk about a lawyer, especially a sports lawyer, a renowned sports lawyer who's been playing sports himself, and an author, it's very fascinating for me. And that is Mr. Nandan Kamath himself. Hello, Mr. Kamath. Welcome to our podcast.
Thank you so much. Pleasure to be here.
How are you doing?
Good. A lot of people describe me as well-rounded. So.
Come on. I get a little conscious and nervous when I have to talk to lawyers because I know I'm going to be lawyered.
Yeah, you should be. Yeah.
I should be, right? Yeah, he's agreeing readily. But tell me, you have ticked every box off. You've grown up playing sports. You've obviously been a good student. There is NLS on your resume. There's Oxford on your resume. There is Harvard on your resume. And you must have been such a good boy, the typical Sharma ji ka beta. I'm sure there are a lot of parents out there using you as an example for their kids.
You can't use Sharma ji for ka beta in Bangalore. Sorry.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I think it's, I had a very privileged upbringing. So I think education was a large part of what was a priority in my family. So my father's a chartered accountant. My mother was a cartoonist, political cartoonist.
Wow.
So there was a lot of stuff going on in our house in terms of books and thinking and other things like that. So education was important, but then also play was important. So sport became a very large part of my life. And I think the combination of the two really worked well for a young person who was motivated, was looking for ways to sort of use one's skills.
Yeah.
So I think sport was a wonderful outlet, but education was always there at the back as a important part of what development meant.
When you get both the things right, nothing can go wrong. You have sports and you're enjoying it and you are good in your education, you're sorted for life.
Lots can go wrong, but the whole thing with sport is about trying to figure out how to sort of overcome challenges, right? And I think that's in many ways what sport gave me, was the ability to look at a challenge, break it down and to, in some sense, attack it. So, I mean, a lot of people ask, the educational journey, but I felt like I was less of a student, but more a sports person, sort of in that academic environment and really looking at it, not really as competition left and right of how other people were doing, but just to see that opportunity and how do you maximize what you can get out of that opportunity. And I think that's a very much sporting mindset, to look at a goal and then work sort of in a determined manner to break it down and
even to push yourself, I think that comes from sports.
Very much. And I think a lot of people ask, like, what is it that motivates you? And I think it's just trying to find my own boundaries, to see what my talent, what talent is there, and to, in some sense, see how far I can take it. And really, that's the human quest for me.
Very true. Very true. But tell me, you played competitive sports, you played cricket, you played hockey. It must have not been an easy decision to say, you know what, I will just do it as a side thing, and I will just go on with my education and get a career which is so time consuming. You will know you can give very little time for sports, which you love so much. Not an easy decision, right?
Yeah, I mean, as a young person, I don't think you take on this whole thing of tough decision, easy decision. You just look at what is next in front of you, right? And I was playing very high quality, high level of sport.
Yeah.
So hockey was my first sport. I played it at the school level, wonderful team sport.
Yeah.
But as I went along, I found that cricket was the sport that really connected, and I started doing quite well.
Right.
Played at the state level, played at the national level, captain Karnataka at
Wow.
the junior level.
Yeah.
So in that sense, it all was going well.
Yeah.
But you reach a point where decisions have to be made, and I
Yeah.
was one of those kids who had to make that sports versus studies decision. I mean, absolutely no regrets because I've managed to continue working in sport and sort of reconnecting with my passion. And perhaps over a lifetime, might be able to contribute more to sport than if I was a sports person. So in that sense, yes, there are some feelings, or it could have gone a different way. But are there regrets? Absolutely not. So.
Very true. Now, a lot of people who are watching this, they might not know what exactly sports lawyer does. What does it entail? If you have to tell them a little bit, more about that, elaborate on that, we'll be very happy.
Yeah, I mean, there is a debate on whether there's such a thing as a sports lawyer at all. Right?
Exactly.
So, I mean, there are lawyers and then there are matters relating to
sports. Yes.
But I mean, in India, we haven't really developed a huge amount of sports law itself.
Yeah.
I mean, there's many rules of sport. There's laws that apply to sports organizations and other things like that. But typically, when you look at a sort of a profession of lawyering within sport, there can be many different elements. So one is disputes, right? So when a matter comes up, you're on one side representing a client in a court or a tribunal or anything like that. Yeah. And most of those disputes are around selections or elections in a body or something like that. So essentially, sports-related disputes could be one of them. The other is governance of bodies. So sports bodies have to essentially make rules, apply them,
legal side,
and sort of make sure that sports is actually organized in the way that it's meant to be organized, is governed the way it's meant to be organized. And I think the third is the commercial side of sport. So the transactional aspects of sport, making sure that the commerce of sport happens. So it could be broadcasting, it could be sponsorships, it could be endorsements, and there are many, many different stakeholders within sport. It could be sports bodies, it could be the government, it could be athletes, teams, federations, sponsors. So in some sense, to understand how this whole industry works and to know what is important to your client. So understanding your client's needs, understanding their priorities and representing them in a transaction. It could be negotiation, it could be documentation. We do a huge variety of things like setting up leagues, helping teams in some sense operate within league structure. So it's a lot of variety. And lots of it is understanding of context, but also what the person's interest is in the broader ecosystem of sport.
Are we allowed to talk about your clients? Name a few, no?
No, I mean, we generally don't talk about clients, but I think we've been very fortunate to have mandates as, like, for example, we were lawyers for the Cricket World Cup. We work with multiple IPL teams. So cricket has been a large part of the last 15, 16 years since the IPL started. But that's also given rise to many other opportunities for other sports to professionalize a little bit. So we work with athletes from across multiple different sports. We've helped set up leagues in a variety of different disciplines like chess and other things, even most recently pickleball. So it's nice to see that whole variety. And you feel like you're contributing to an emerging sector. And you feel like over time, your contribution has a knock-on effect on many, many young people making careers, sort of helping that talent come to the fore. So in some sense, you're pioneering and helping build structures which could have long-term effects. And I think that's the pleasure of the job. So
and also coming to the landscape, sports, when we talk about sports, so many things have changed over time. Even when you talk about it, from a legal point of view. For you, what has been a drastic change when you look at it? Okay, this has gotten better and this has just gone down, for worse. What do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I think there's a long way to go in the way that we structure and govern sport. I mean, there's sports law, but there's also sports governance and sports policy. To me, these three things need to merge, which is the legal structures, the governance structures, and the policy sort of an understanding of where we want to go. So historically, sport was very much a patronage-based model. So before independence, lots of it was sort of supported by the Maharajas, by essentially a donation structure, right? And then after we went, after 1947, the government didn't really prioritize it. There were many other things like building educational institutions, defense organizations. So sport was not very high on the priority list. But over time, we've seen a gradual sort of growth in the understanding of what sport can be for us.
Yeah.
And it's not just about how many medals we can win at the Olympics,
Yeah.
but the role that sport plays across a wide range of things. It could be the economy of sport and what it does for jobs and skilling and essentially economic growth. It could be the social impact of sport and how sport can actually change the way we live, change the way we are more healthy, more productive, bring more women into the field of play. So it has multiple different elements, and I think the last 10, 15 years, we've really made a shift in our understanding of what sport can do to build a nation. And it's not just a sporting nation which is actually going out to win at the Olympics, Paralympics, and in other disciplines, but what sport becomes an instrument to deliver nationhood. And that notion of building community, but building a healthy community, a productive one, and one that we are all proud to live in, right? It's not just that other people are winning on our behalf, and that's a wonderful thing, of course, but that all of us are sort of participants rather than spectators to someone else's journey. And I think that's the arc of progress that we're seeing. There's no shortage of talent. 15, 20 years ago, I mean, there was a lot of cynicism. That cynicism has gone away. The ambition is there. There's a burning ambition in our professional athletes. But you look around you, there are more and more people playing sport, wanting to be fit, wanting to build communities around sport. And I think those are all very healthy trends. There's a long way to go in terms of building our policy structures, making sure that governance, everyone knows what role they're playing. And I would say a more public-spirited governance. And I think sport law will play a role in helping those structures, in some sense, deliver the potential. So I think, like I said, those three pillars coming together can play a very significant role.
I was coming to that only. I was coming to the bill, the latest draft, Sports Governance Bill of 2024, and I wanted to have your opinion on it,
Yeah, so I think the Sports Governance Bill, it's in draft stage, and it actually followed the draft sports policy as well. So these are two documents that are in play right now. And the hope is that we're building much more regulatory capacity. So like I said earlier, we moved into a structure where the government was not prioritizing sport. Then we moved to a structure where the government was the only one delivering sport. So if you look at every scheme, whether it's the Target Olympic Podium scheme, whether it's the Khelo India scheme, it's always the government, in some sense, responsible for bringing both the money as well as the implementation. But if you have to grow this, you can't have one central government playing the entire role, right? There's so many different stakeholders. It could be state governments. It's certainly the federations. It's non-profit organizations. It's, in fact, all of us have some form of role to play.
Very true.
So in many ways, the sports policy becomes the vision document. Saying that this is what we could do as a sporting nation. And I think earlier sports policies have been very much about how do we win more medals? And the grassroots sports is how do we get more talent and help them to win medals? So it was a very narrow view of what sport is. And it was government, in some sense, saying government is going to do it. But if you look at the most recent draft national sports policy, it really talks about sport as part of a nation-building exercise. So the role of sport in economic development, it could be manufacturing, it could be tourism, it could be skilling and jobs that come from sport. Actually, in much more mature economies, you have a large percent, up to 2% of the economy is people having jobs related to sport. And we have a huge gap in number of people actually professionally engaged in sport and sport-allied sectors. But it also talks about the social development aspects and the role that all of us can play. So sport as a sort of a participatory pursuit. So it's not looking at just these top 200 elite athletes going to the Olympics, but how do you, in some sense, weave sport into your and my lives and everyone's lives? Regardless of privilege or regardless of whether you're in an urban or rural area, just making sport accessible and helping us derive the benefits of sport. Now, with that backdrop, that's a very large pursuit, right? And it needs everyone to play different positions. So for example, in a football team, you have a goalkeeper, you have a striker, you have midfielders, you have defenders, and everyone knows their role. So in some sense, the policy and then the draft sports bill is essentially is laying out a pathway to how do we all play as one team. So if you want to build a Team India, all of these stakeholders need to come together. It could be states, it could be the central government, it could be the federations, it could be all of us. But clarity of where we want to get to and then the roles each person plays a very, very important role in delivering that.
I always keep talking about how, we forget there's only not that one person who's number 1, number 2, or the top 10, people in one particular sport. There will be somebody who's a number 67, number 80, who's doing very well on his own level. And to find people to support these people, because these people will still exist with the toppers. That also becomes a challenge, for all the other bodies as well, along with the government, because you have to be there for everybody there.
Yes.
Present.
Because you're 67 of today's potential number one of 2 years from now, right? So essentially, this is the central core of policy and even governance structures. And I think part of what we have to recognize is that sports federations are really the central bodies across the world in delivering sports objectives at an excellence level.
Right.
Some countries have been able to separate sports governance bodies which work in excellence and others that work at the community level.
Right.
Perhaps it's time for us to think about that as well. But you want autonomous sports bodies that are also accountable.
Right.
So the sports bill, what it tries to do is say that we recognize the autonomy of sports bodies and that these are democratic bodies to be elected from within sport. But we also expect, because these are bodies that are playing a public function.
Yeah.
They're selecting the national teams. They're helping, in some sense, the talent development system come.
Yeah.
They're using India name, India flag. If you're going to do that, even though if you're a private autonomous body, you have some responsibilities as well.
Right.
So what it tries to do is balance this autonomy with accountability.
Right.
So the bill tries to set up multiple new institutions, which is like a sports regulatory board, a tribunal to actually look at decisions and disputes, making sure that they don't have to keep going back to court, which gets log jammed and takes very often many years.
Yeah.
It sets up a sports election panel to oversee the elections and make sure that they're fairly held. So all of these structures help the state in some sense to move from less implementation, more regulatory mode. So a regulator in some sense says, okay, there all of you come and play. And we will be in some sense the backstop and the arbitrator of this to make sure that everyone is playing their own position.
Right.
And when you're claiming some form of monopoly like the federations do, you do that in an accountable manner as well.
Oh, that sounds good. I think there's a lot of things.
Many slips between the cup and the lip. So I think a lot of it comes down to the implementation, having really strong leadership within sports governing bodies, but also in the regulator.
Right. On a lighter note now, taking you away from all the seriousness, if you were to, bust a myth, say, about the sporting world, which one would you go after?
I mean, in some sense, we've already gone after one of the myths, which was myth was that there wasn't really sports talent in the country. And I think we spent 15 years trying to go after that myth. And then there was a myth of, we're good at 4 or 5 types of sports. We're not good at sports which require strength, agility. So we saw badminton and a few other sports. But then lots of those myths have been broken. And my belief is that in our 1.4 billion, we have a potential world champion in pretty much any sport. Because it's just there. We have not set up the systems yet to go and find that talent. I mean, you have 1/6 of the world's population. And if you're saying that we don't have the raw material, there's things that have to be worked on, of course. And I think nutrition and the sort of early childhood rates of physical activity are the 2 cores. But the raw talent, I think there's tremendous amount in this country.
Right. Now, moving on to IPs, that's an issue in the sporting world. And especially from the legal point of view, if you were to stress on it, any challenges there for you?
Now, when you talk about intellectual property, it's really at the core of sport. And that's a lot of the work that we end up doing. When you talk about broadcast rights, you talk about sponsorships, you talk about merchandise like T-shirts and other things like that. All of it is embedded in intellectual property, be it copyrights, be it trademarks. There's also a lot of the products that are patented. So it's very intrinsically related. So a lot of my work has in the past also been in intellectual property, and bringing that to sport has been a very interesting part of the work. But it also has a very sort of unique relationship, right? So you want intellectual property and you want more innovation in sport, but you also want to make sure that things are not locked away. Where only a few people get access to this type of equipment. Or maybe someone comes up with a new sporting move that only they get to do it. Because you want sport to be open, you want people to be constantly improving upon other people's work. So you don't want certain things locked up. So while you can say the sports industry is driven by intellectual property, what happens on the field of play is kept very much open for continuous innovation. So in some sense, keeping field of play free from intellectual property is also part of sports policy, I would say.
I was going to ask you about that. It must be so challenging because there's an athlete who's very much focused on his or her game, and to keep all of this, because there's so many things, the trappings away from them, and say you just play. But I don't think that happens, like 100% they can just focus on their game unless they have like a really big manager or agent who's taking care of everything. If there's an athlete who doesn't have that kind of representation, will it become very difficult for them?
I think you've hit on a very significant issue, because when you recognize most professions, we peak in our 20s, 30s, 40s. While athletes are confronting very challenging issues, be they commercial, be they legal, very, very early on, right? So you might be 17, 18, 19, 20. And with a maybe 10 or 15 year sort of pathway to go. So in many of these cases, getting good advice early on is a very, very important role. So which is why also we try our best to get in early with lots of the athletes. Because the minute you're dealing with someone who's already had 8 or 10 years of work, you are actually unraveling lots of mistakes. Because very often young athletes just look at, okay, how much money is there? Just sign the contract without even reading what's in it. So a lot of our work is also in educating young athletes to not just jump at financial decisions. The manager and agent ecosystem is not very well developed in India. It's much more of a marketing type ecosystem where you're marketing them for endorsements. But I think more and more athletes are recognizing the role of trusted advisors. In our context, a lot of them end up being brothers or very close friends and other things. It's a professional layer that has to also develop, because in some sense, making the right decisions professionally is also very related to things like wealth management, investments, and making sure you're not, the minute someone's successful, the number of people that converge on that successful person is also quite incredible to see. And in some sense, both insulating as well as advising becomes a very important part of the role.
Very true, very true. Now, moving on to a topic which is quite grey in the sporting world, that is the gender problem. It's very binary. And recently, this Olympics, there was a major issue, in example, boxing. Yes, a lot of people raised a lot of questions. There was a lot of debate around it. How do you legally deal with something like that? Because, it becomes an issue, right? It's not very cut and dry.
Yeah, and actually, this is one of the central themes in my book, Boundary Land, which is talking about the hard boundaries that sport actually enforces on us, and how they're extremely difficult to judge the fairness of necessarily. And gender's at the front end of it. And one thing we do have to recognize is gender is so ingrained in our psyche as well. And that's the way sport is also classified. So most of our sports have separate female and male categories of events. There are a couple of events at the Olympics where everyone competes in the same event. But most of our sport actually believes that men are probably going to have significant advantages over women, or born male over born female. But it requires a very hard line to be drawn. So everyone knows where it's the sort of the typical male, typical female. But there are many people born, and perhaps some people transitioning, transgender. So you're moving from the female to the male category or the male to the female category, where in some sense complicates this very hard line that we're drawing. So it's a binary in the rules, but gender is potentially fluid.
It's very fluid.
And in many tellings, you can just choose your own gender, right? So sex and gender being quite different concepts. So there are multiple very challenging issues. One of them is where there are DSD athletes, so people with differences in sexual development. There are people who have both male and female organs, different chromosomal structures, and they're born like that. So it's a very hard line. Do you classify them as male or female? Very tough. Even tougher now, the challenge is coming of people who are transitioning. There are people born female and transitioning to male as well. But that is not seen in sport as so much of a challenge, right? Because they're moving from the easier category to the tougher or presumed tougher category.
Nobody's going to question that.
But the significant one is where someone has been male for 10, 15, 20 years, gone through male development, so finished male development and then transitioning, the theory is that many of the male advantages are already in that person. So even if you go through the various sort of hormone replacement and any type of surgery, the suggestion in sport is that you already have the advantages and those are not going to go away. Now, this is not a well-established scientific truth.
Yeah.
And we are in that transition phase of trying to understand this, because there are clearly sort of social recognition of male and female. Scientifically, who is male and who's female, the lines are not so sharp as what sport is demanding.
Yeah.
And there's very strong notions of also fairness.
Yes.
So someone who's has always been in the female category is going to say you're introducing people who actually have male advantages and trying to bring them to our category in a way that actually impinges on my ability to compete and my ability to excel. So you're bringing in a new type of unfairness. While the person who's transitioning is saying, but isn't it only fair to allow me to express my own gender in the way that I choose, right?
Yeah.
So in some sense, it is these two very, very challenging notions.
It's so catch-22. How do you legally decide?
Yeah, so I think all sports bodies are trying to figure that out. We are in that phase. So originally the International Olympic Committee tried to draw a very hard line for all sport.
Yeah.
But more recently what they've said is it is actually comes down to each sport. So a sport like badminton versus weightlifting, huge difference, right? In terms of the way a transitioning gender might actually apply.
Boxing.
Now, what the Olympic Committee has said is that each international federation needs to make up its own guidelines on gender, and for both trans athletes as well as athletes with DSD.
Yeah.
And those are very importantly two different things. So some people are just born in what you would call ambiguous gender.
Yes.
And you should not necessarily classify them in the same way that someone who's actually by choice actually transitioning gender. And I think you're going to have a policy for both, very distinct.
But what would be your personal take on it?
I think it's very difficult to have a personal take because it really depends on where you stand. Like I think the famous quote is, "Where you stand on this depends on where you sit."
Yes.
I mean, if my daughter was playing sport and suddenly you saw someone coming into her category, you would very clearly object to it.
I know.
But if my son wanted to transition and wanted to play in that category, I would say, yes, you should be fair. So it completely depends on your notion of your priority list. All of us have priorities, right? Is it inclusion or is it that notion of fairness to the female participant? Some people will prioritize one, some people may prioritize another. But my theory is that in the long run, what's going to happen is you're going to have one category of sport for people who are born female.
Yeah.
And then you're going to have an open category, which absolutely anyone can participate in. A few sports already have this. Like if you look at chess, you have a female category and then you have an open category. So you'll have women who are grandmasters, not female grandmasters, but just grandmasters.
Just grandmasters,
But I mean, it's not such a easy thing to just sort of hold open categories and expect women who have been historically excluded from sport to actually come and compete and win.
In a sport like boxing, it becomes very difficult.
Very difficult. So if you made it open field, how many women would even turn up? And it's not just a fairness issue. In sports like boxing, there's also a safety element. Would you put a female boxer against a male boxer? And there's potential risks, and sport has to look at safety risks as well.
Yes. And also moving on to Gosports, you are one of the managing trustees at Gosports, and Gosports has been doing fantastic work with so many athletes. Now, it is also not an easy thing to do, to bring a foundation up and to manage everything, manage athletes. Let's talk about that. How did it come to be and how is it going?
I think Gosports is very much, a labor of love over now 16 years. It came through with a couple of my school friends. We actually started this up. Our belief was we had to overcome the cynicism about talent in India. You talked a little bit earlier about what are the myths you wanted to bust. And there's so many myths that India is not good at sport, that we have to, in some sense, just confine our ambitions to being mediocre. And something felt very wrong. So I'd seen the way sport is organized. I had studied in the US, I'd studied in the UK, and just how sport had really given more people a chance than we had ever given. I mean, I'd played at the state level here, and I saw even my college or community team had better facilities than my state team.
Yeah.
So there was a huge gap, and I felt like we were making very general statements about the lack of talent without even having tried.
Right.
So Gosports was really motivated by giving our athletes a chance, and in some sense trying to change mindset and the belief structure, not just in athletes, but in all of us.
Right.
And our belief was that if you could create a few really exceptional athletes, that mindset shift would change into behavior shift. The behavior shift would change into different funding structures and governance structures. So we wanted to create the first of many different types of athletes.
Right.
Pick up the really challenging, tough battles in Indian sport. So we ended up working with a gymnast who went to the Olympics, a fencer who went to the Olympics, many of the badminton players who were like in the 300s or 400s of the rankings, taking like a Srikanth in the Kidambi to number 1 in the world. So picking the tough battles and showing that they're possible. Why did we believe it was important? Because we, as a nation, we had to overcome cynicism.
Right.
And that was what the Gosports project was about, to show that it is possible. And that 16-year journey, I think now to even say we don't have talent in this country, no, people would laugh you out of the room. And to me, that is the success of what Gosports is. It's not the number of medals. It's not the sort of the particular 3, 4, 5 athletes who've gone to exceptional things. We've supported 300-400 athletes at this point. And each of them is shifting the needle on self-belief of a nation. And I think that is what it's about. Because the minute we start believing in ourselves, we send cultural messages to people around us. It's not just about what happens on the Olympic podium. It's the conversation a parent has with a child. A child has with a competitor. What friends tell you when they hear that you've done well, or even when you've lost. What is the cultural messaging we're giving to people who are competing, playing sport, and trying to make a life and make their talent count? And to me, the daily conversations come from belief and a belief that something is possible.
You know, every time I've interviewed a sport personality, an athlete, one question I ask them is, they know when they're going into it, they know there are going to be more losses than wins.
Yes.
There's going to be a lull and you have to deal with it. The mental strength to deal with it is crazy. But also for someone like you, when you run an organization, a foundation like Gosports, it's not always, yes, of course, the plan is to get them to a point where they start winning.
Yes.
But that again, the percentage of it, is very less. And yet the journey is what matters. And I always like to emphasize on that. It is not just about that one athlete who's going to go win that gold medal or silver medal, right? It is also about how well they are doing. It's not just those 3 people on the podium who are doing well. And I'm sure the foundation recognizes that it's not just about those people with the medals in their hands. It's also about other athletes who are good at the sport.
And that has always been a philosophy. I think you hit the nail on the head. Is just at the end of the day, medals are the product of a system that you create. And you have to actually water the plants. The fruits come out at the end, right? So you can't say, I want the fruit. You have to say, I want to plant the orchard. And I think that's the approach that is going to serve Indian sport well. We've shown a model where a well-governed organization that does things responsibly is able to use funding in a structured manner. And the products are there for everyone to see. I think the report card is very clear. And that report card is not the medals, but it's just a nation beginning to believe that so much more is possible, that talent exists. And now it's about connecting talent to opportunity. It's not about the existence of talent itself. So in some sense, that orchard that's been built has produced enough fruit to say that we can all, in some sense, nurture such orchards.
No, but does funding become very difficult?
So I think funding was very difficult in the early stages. I mean, it was pretty much non-existent. And the response we got in most cases is, you're wasting your time, there's no talent, do something else and do something more meaningful. But I think the CSR mandate helped us a lot. Sport became one of the aspects that you could support CSR in. And I think with little amounts of money, the amount we could do has brought more and more very, very established donors to the picture. So we run some of the most significant CSR projects in sport. Funding is no longer the challenge. It's about actually structuring programs where we believe we can maximize the impact, because these are all, in some sense, projects that other people also look at and try and replicate and build. So we are always on the lookout to be the front of the game. So we built the first program that supported Paralympic athletes, along with funders like IndusInd Bank and Sony Pictures and Gamescraft and others. So we were the first to support any Paralympic athletes. And you see how far that has come. We're very happy for others to take over and in some sense continue to build. And we'll find the next challenge in some sense to lead. So Gosports will always be on the frontier, doing things that other people are not doing, and in some sense, always pushing the needle of what our belief systems are, what we think we're capable of doing, and what we think is meaningful to do. I would like Gosports to continuously push those boundaries.
Sounds fantastic. I, for one, am very happy, because I'm a fan of so many people Gosports, has supported. Therefore, now touching a topic which is like a deep, dark territory, that is social media and defamation. And legally speaking, I'm sure this is quite challenging for a lawyer who's especially dealing with sports. Let's talk about that. Because social media on different levels, because I'm sure conjures up different problems that you haven't maybe dealt with it before, because new age system, new age problems and all of that. How do you go about that? And what's the most challenging thing about it?
So I think the toughest part of social media is anonymity, right? So when you can speak without being identified, it changes the whole equation. You say things that you would never say when you meet someone. So a lot of in some sense, the filters are dropped when you don't have to take accountability for what you say, but also the remote nature of it, that you don't need to look the person in the eye and say stuff. So the structure of the internet and social media has in some sense taken the humanity out of relationships. So the communication that arises, and it comes so much in sport. We see it all the time, the trolling of athletes as they do worse, just the amount of vitriol that comes from fan clubs of some opponent. It's incredible to see how we are populating the public domain with toxic information. And I think you just need to be in the shoes of the other person to know what it's like. So I would love to have people understand, if you were that person, let's say playing a really tough Olympic semi-final, and then you open up your phone, you've lost the match, and there's literally 500,000 abuses. How would you feel on the other side of that? We try and get our athletes to not look at social media, but that's also impossible, right? That's part of the life that they lead. But the thing I would say is, even on social media, even if you're anonymous, every interaction, think, are you adding value to the public domain, or are you in some sense diluting it? And we have to eventually take responsibility for that public domain, because it's all of us, right? Just because I speak and no one can hold me accountable doesn't mean that speech doesn't add to that domain.
Very true, very true. And like I said, it's a deep, dark territory.
And I think defamation law has not been used actively yet in India. It is a place of concern, because libel is in many other places, you could win large civil suits. Here, it's more used as sort of criminal defamation. You try and cause as much havoc to the other person. You put some 100 crore notice in most defamation cases, but nothing happens.
Nothing happens.
So there's very little genuine account. At most, you get some apology.
No, I always think like it's an empty threat when somebody says, I'm going to
sue you. But the reality is, all of us have reputations. And reputation actually has a commercial value, reputation and goodwill. And until we recognize that in the law, in libel law, and you'll see a lot of people talk about this, there has to be compensation.
Very true.
If you're going to dilute my reputation, pay for it. The minute you have to pay for something, your behavior completely changes.
It regulates so many things.
And I feel like so many people say things they don't even mean, because there is no accountability and no liability.
Now, moving on, you actually managed to write a book about sports as well. You made it, again, your primary career. Your law, also legally you're around sports. Again, you run a foundation which is about sports. Also, you go ahead and write a book which is about sports. It's called Boundary Lab, if I'm right.
That's right.
Yeah, please tell us about your book.
So Boundary Lab, in some sense, this was, it started just before COVID. I'd sort of reached a point where I felt like there was a lot of ideas in my head. They were not concrete ideas, but I knew that I wanted to express them in some way. So start putting them down and just sort of organizing my thoughts. So I said, okay, maybe it's time to write something. Start jotting down my ideas. Then COVID came. where suddenly I got so much more
Yeah.
time to really get this to seep in. I'm a graduate of the National Law School, so
Yes.
they also asked me to teach a course. So that also became a little bit of a driver to organize my thoughts.
Yeah.
So I taught a course on sports, law and society. And that structure turned into eventually Boundary Lab as a book. So originally it was going to be a little bit like a textbook on sports law and other things like that, because that's my field of interest. But then I felt like there was something deeper there and something that I wanted to speak to a larger audience. So not just lawyers and law students, but what I really wanted to convey is how important a role sports plays in populating our public domain. My belief is that sport actually is at the front end. It could be around gender, it could be around fairness, it could be multiple different elements. What is independence in governance? Sport actually is the laboratory, and that's why Boundary Lab of where the boundaries lie between one side and the other. So many debates, actually sport becomes the front end laboratory. And that is a concept I wanted to bring out. Why? Because at the end of the day, sport is very often seen as a very marginal thing. Oh, this happened in sport, it's just entertainment. But to me, all of these battles have to be fought on fair terms. And if you care about gender, how can you not care about what's happening in sport, for example, right? So I felt like it was important to communicate that it's important that all of us are stakeholders and should be participating in the debates in sport. So really front-ending sport as a public platform, an important public platform. So a little bit was, okay, I've worked in it so long, why am, so a little bit of a self-understanding of why have I got so passionate about this field. So a little bit of professional autobiography and thoughts. Maybe some would argue is justifying why I've worked in sport. But also I wanted to pass on the broader message that this is something worth fighting for. Fairness and appropriate rule making is not just about whether sport is played fairly. All of that has downstream effects on societies, on the way we live, on principles, on morals, on ethics. So I do believe that book can help people understand the broader role that sport plays in our society.
Right. I am going to read it. But now I have a rapid fire segment prepared. Do not worry, it's not sensational. Very simple. Just to get to know you better. And let's start with, what is one of the most common words you use, a common word that you use as a lawyer?
Depends.
Depends. Of course. Diplomacy right there.
So most people, is it right or wrong? You have to say it depends.
It's a safe word. Rather.
Depends on the facts. Depends on the context.
Very clever, I must say. And one change in Indian sports policy that you want to see?
I would love to see a significant leadership development program in Indian sport, where we're able to grow more people who are willing to take on governance positions in sports bodies, governance positions in sort of regulation of sport. So really a bunch of young people excited to build Indian sport. That's a policy change I would love to see.
And one Indian athlete who inspires you?
I love Neeraj Chopra and what he stands for and how he's carried himself. I think he has the ability to resonate with all of India. The way he won his gold, the way he won his silver and the way he's carried himself between those periods, I think incredible. I love the attitude, but also the authenticity.
Both, yes. And if you were to, pick a sport now and start all over again, if you had a chance to do that.
With my current physical state, or do I get to go back as well?
Come on, you know what I mean.
I'm contemplating pickleball.
Everybody, there's this craze, around pickleball. Everybody wants to try pickleball.
I've played with my little son, but not played it seriously yet. So.
Your favorite Bollywood movie about sport?
Bollywood movie, I think it has to be Chak De India.
I loved it.
So I just found the authenticity with which Shah Rukh Khan played that role. And to me, the moment of the film is after they win, you would expect someone to be jumping and excited. But the way they show his face of just essentially, it's not joy, but it's in some mix of relief and
closure.
And I think it just carried the raw emotion of sport in a way which was very relevant for that time in particular. And resurgence of hockey has also happened after that. So it had significant impact maybe inspired a few young boys and girls to play as well.
It was a good blend, you know. It wasn't very documentary. It was entertaining, and yet they stick to a lot of.
And the amazing thing is the songs are played at cricket matches. So
everywhere.
So imagine that. So if you can actually seep into cricket culture, I think that's a success. So.
That's a good one. And also a project that you're proud of, a pet project.
I would say just Gosports is something I'm incredibly proud of. To have been a participant in building an organization where it looked like you had no chance, to being on the front end of change.
Yeah.
I think very few things can replace that, frankly. So.
Go-to sport for you to say watch. Which is that one sport that you enjoy watching the most?
I mean, I watch cricket most. Can't get my
no
eyes
surprises
off
there.
Sadly, yeah. Once you played the sport.
Yeah.
But it's also interesting as a lawyer to start watching it. You're not just watching it for the sport any longer. You're watching to see how it's structured. You're watching to see how the ads are played. So it's a much wider context. When you look at something as a professional, some of the fun goes away, but like you're watching it with an eagle eye to know what's happening next in sports broadcasting, what's happening in advertising.
I was going to ask you that. Can you ever stop being objective?
Very tough. So you actually are no longer just a sort of a spectator and watching it just for fun. So sometimes, I mean, they say follow your passion, but sometimes following your passion can mean that it's actually not so much fun anymore, but still.
This is a tricky one. Since you work with so many IPL teams and all of that, if I were to ask you, till date, what do you enjoy watching more, a test match or an IPL match?
I love watching test matches. So I think just the narrative arcs of a test match are incredible. And I spend way more time probably watching test matches than T20. I think T20 for me is like a Friends episode. You can switch it on, switch it off. And you'll have fun. It's not that I don't enjoy watching T20. But in terms of the story of a test match, very few things can compare.
I have jumped off my couch, watching BGT this time, the first test. It was amazing. But, I would want to wrap it up with a parting shot from you. If you were to tell our audience about the impact sports has on one's life, on one's nation, the importance of it, if you could emphasize on that, that would be perfect.
Yeah, I'm an incredibly biased party to talk about that because in some sense, sport has really informed everything I do. And for me, it's a crucial lens in the way I look at the world. But sport to me is just such a large part of life. We understand our world initially through play. It's the first sense we get about what is just and unjust. You have to share your toy. You have to navigate disputes with maybe your sibling or some friend. So we forget, all of us have always been sports people. But many of us drop out along the way. Most of us drop out along the way. But how do you keep your love for sport alive and reconnect if you've actually disconnected from sport, back with sport, moving away from spectatorship to actually being a participant? And that shift is a sometimes difficult one, but it can actually change your life. And it's not just from a fitness perspective. And I talk about the role that sport has in fun, friends, and also the feedback you get, right? You get fitter, you may be happier. So it's a very like a reverse report card. In your academic report card, you want all A's, right? So here, these are 3 F's. So try and build on that notion of having fun. And I think there are very few things that give us just pure joy, and moving your body and being in a social circle where you're making new friends. Sport is an incredible way to build that community. And then just the different types of feedback that it gives you. It can change the way you live, change the way you relate to other people, integrate into society. And then as all of us build these types of lives, I think our nation becomes a sort of healthier, more productive one.
Better place.
Better place for all of us.
Yeah, but it's been an absolute pleasure having this chat with you. And I learned so many new things. Though you did know, you were a little cagey on a couple of questions.
That goes with the territory of being a lawyer.
You only extract information. You won't divulge it so freely. But I loved our chat. Thank you so much for making time.
Lovely speaking with you.
Same here.
I mean, in some sense, we've already gone after one of the myths, which was the myth was that there wasn't really sports talent in the country. And I think we spent 15 years trying to go after that myth. And then there was a myth of, oh, we're good at 4 or 5 types of sports. We're not good at sports which require strength, agility. So we saw badminton and a few other sports. But then lots of those myths have been broken. And my belief is that in our 1.4 billion, we have a potential world champion in pretty much any sport. Because it's just there. We have not set up the systems yet to go and find that talent. I mean, you have 1/6 of the world's population. And if you're saying that we don't have the raw material, there's things that have to be worked on, of course. And I think nutrition and the sort of early childhood rates of physical activity are the 2 cores. But the raw talent, I think there's tremendous amount in this country.